Today what I want to do is I want to give an overview of a couple of projects that I've been working on that I hope will turn into a book project soon enough. And what I'm interested in is taking some thoughts about cognitive architecture and some thoughts about philosophy of neuroscience and using them to think more broadly about agency and decision making. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the way that philosophers tend to employ folk psychological notions when they're talking about action and agency. I think there are some problematic ambiguities in the way that they go about doing it. And then I'm going to talk about a perspective on decision making that I've been working on, drawing on a couple areas in psychology and neuroscience, which I call a competitive sensory motor decision making mechanism. So I'm going to argue that this is a way of explaining agency in a way that just doesn't really appeal to folk psychological notions in the way that philosophy of action does, or philosophy of psychology does, that's inspired by philosophy of action. So then I'm going to talk about some responses that people would tend to make and draw some conclusions about the explanatory status of folk psychology from the discussion. I've actually done a fair bit of work on this, so all these papers are available on my webpage. The paper that I'm talking mostly about today is this paper that's forthcoming in Oxford Studies in Agency and Responsibility. Normally, I don't like to talk about work that the paper's already in the works, but given that this is a bigger project and this is my first kind of positive paper in the area, I'm hoping to get as much feedback as possible before I make the mistake of sitting down to write this book. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about agency and folk psychological explanation. Philosophy of action is concerned with agency. It's interested in what the conditions are for being a rational agent. And it tends to focus on reflective human agency. But there's also a notion of agency that we very much share with other organisms, which I characterize, I don't define it this way, but I characterize it as follows. And this is just the ability to kind of produce flexible behaviors in response to options in your environment, and to modulate behavior appropriately to attain your goals. So I always like to talk about Buridan's ass in these contexts because I still think it's one of my favorite philosophical examples, kind of because I feel like I would probably starve to death in between the bales of hay, but so we can come back to that. So the theory that I'm going to be talking about, my kind of current stalking horse in this talk, comes from the philosophy of action, but has recently been employed in the philosophy of psychology in a way that I'll talk about. And that is the causal theory of action that we probably all learned about in the past. And on the causal theory, what makes an act an intentional act is that it stands in the right causal relationship to one's reasons. And reasons are in turn explained as compounds of propositional attitudes. So basically on this view, you've got propositional attitudes, belief, desire, intention, and these have to cause your bodily movement in the right way. And if they do, then your bodily movement is an action. But there's also a tie of this into this idea of rational agency. So Mary Robbins and Elizabeth Patry sum this up in the following way. If my action is to be rational, then it seems like there has to be some kind of relationship between my bodily movements and the intentional states that cause them. So usually people flesh this out as a kind of semantic relationship, or a combined, what I call a content-preserving causal process. So if I want to change my slide right now, my arm movement that flicks the cursor has to stand in the right kind of causal and semantic relationship. It has to be the content of my intention that causes my body to move in a particular kind of way. And when that relation obtains, there is a rational relationship, then my action is a rationalized action. So I think in philosophy of action more broadly, there's a bit of an ambiguity in how we talk about the attitudes. And there's two different ways we can do it. One is what I call an implementation neutral way of talking about the attitudes. And when you talk about psychological attitudes on this kind of view, again, beliefs, desires, intentions, you kind of give them a functional gloss and say, okay, well, we're going to think about attitudes as the kinds of things that precede action, involve mental content, and sort of a certain kind of functional role in the generation of action. But then we're gonna leave it totally open what the nature of those states is. So a couple of views that I take this kind of position. So Peter Railton's view of beliefs and desires, he thinks that ultimately what beliefs and desires are the results of reinforcement learning in subcortical areas of the brain that we have no conscious access to, right? So this is pretty far removed from the everyday notion of psychological attitudes, but he thinks, okay, well, this is what neuroscience reveals to be the nature of the attitudes. Similarly, Wayne Wu thinks that intentions particularly solve what he calls many problems. So an intention just sort of takes a behavioral option and glues it to an action opportunity in the environment. Again, he's, at least in conversation, I've talked with him a lot about this, he's kind of neutral as to like what kind of mental or neural state underlies this kind of explanation. So we can take an implementation neutral view, or we can take an implementation specific view. And this is the view that talking about psychological attitudes, particularly propositional attitudes, entails something very specific about what kind of states those must be. So the I think classic example of this is Churchland's eliminativism about the propositional attitudes, where he says, look, propositional attitudes are sententially structured propositional representations that stand in syllogistic relationships to each other. And if those kinds of things don't occur in the brain, then folk psychology is just false. We should get rid of it. So I think philosophy of action is generally just doesn't say what kind of approach they're taking to the attitudes here. But in philosophy of psychology, the causal theory has been taken up in an implementation-specific way. And I want to argue against that implementation-specific way. So here's the way that I think the causal theory of action shows up in philosophy of psychology and also in certain areas of the empirical sciences. And this is to posit that there are kind of two distinct systems. There's a practical reasoning system that is involved in coming to decisions, and that system operates on propositional representations. It operates on beliefs and desires, and this is the system in which the decision is made. The output of this system is an intention. So as I said earlier on the causal theory, your bodily movements have to stand in the right relationship to your attitudes. So on this view, what this practical reasoning system does is produces an intention, and then the job of the intention is to get the motor system to move in the right way, to put it really simply. So your motor system is involved in controlling your actual bodily movements, the kinematics and dynamics of your action. So the job of these two systems is to coordinate in such a way so that your specific bodily movements are caused in the right way by the intention that's generated by your practical reasoning system. So here are just some kind of existence proofs that people think in this way. So Elizabeth Patry is someone who's done a lot of work to kind of take this philosophy of action view and get it into form for use in philosophy of psychology. And what she says is deliberative values operate on a different kind of apparatus, a different kind of mental representation than motor representation. So they make use of desires, values, general policies. And I'll just call your attention to this. The contents represented at the level of deliberation are obviously rather different than the contents and formats and processes that go on in the motor system. So again, you've got these two distinct systems, one that produces the decision and operates on propositional attitudes, one that controls motor movement. And often what you'll see is people posit some way in which the motor system has to kind of translate the thing that the decision system does so as to implement it in your bodily movements. But I think that this view actually shows up in the sciences as well. There's a very kind of standard thought that motor control is hierarchical. So I think in this quote from Grafton and Hamilton, you see this similar idea that you start out from a very general kind of mental state, the goal to light the cigarette, and then you move from that sort of to a more detailed state, ultimately ending in just a specification of muscle movements, right? That actually, flicks the light or lights the cigarette. So you start with a decision, you start with a goal, and then you in a way kind of piecemeal fill out the details until your body can just undertake the action. So here's this kind of hierarchical picture as Paschery puts it out. So my project in this area started out by just thinking about different kinds of mental representation. So Benza mentioned the perception-cognition distinction. That's how I got started thinking about this. But one thing I kind of realized is that when people talk in these terms, they're employing a view of the different kinds of mental representations that are employed in the different kinds of systems. So this notion of a format for decision and deliberation versus a format for motor control, I got kind of interested in what are these different formats. And the view that I've been developing over the number of papers that I kind of showed is that the difference between what we can call cognitive or propositional attitudes versus sensory motor representations is in terms of their representational format. So the way that they represent the things that they represent. So I'm not the only one who's interested in this view. There's a lot of people in philosophy of perception who are debating whether this view is a good way of grounding the perception-cognition distinction. I'm happy to talk about that more. But let's draw this general distinction between a representation that's lexically or sententially structured and a representation that's structured in such a way so as to control sensory motor movements. So the thing to notice about sentential representation is a couple things. First, it's lexically structured, so it has a grammatical structure. And second, the relationship between the individual items and what they represent is causal or arbitrary in terms of their structure. So if I say giraffe, and this is old, like kind of old standard philosophy of cognitive science stuff. If I say giraffe, the word giraffe, the structure of the orthography of that word is completely arbitrary with regards to the structure of what it represents, namely giraffes. And I think you can say the same thing here. So the conceptual representation grasp the ice cream, right? The lexical concept grasp stands in a kind of arbitrary relationship to the action of grasping. And same thing for ice cream. What makes the sensory motor representations different is they bear a kind of metric relationship to what they represent. So when you represent, when your motor system represents something, it has to represent it in terms of what I call dimensional structure. So that includes the amount of flexion and tension on the muscles. That includes the exertion of force in a particular direction. So this is a very kind of visuospatial form of representation. Similarly, when you grasp towards a particular object, you have to grasp this specific object, right? So the particular ice cream that you'll be orienting towards is oriented a certain kinds of way in your visual field. It's got it's a certain size, right? It's a certain kind of width. So the motor representations that you employ to grasp the ice cream have to work in concert with a visual representation of the ice cream, such that you coordinate the dimensions of your motor action to the dimensions of the grasped object in this case. So the kind of puzzle here that people have noticed is how do you start out from this kind of representation, this very abstract, lexically structured representation, and end up at this very differently structured representation, which is what I call committal to values along all of these visual-motor dimensions. So there's a couple of problems that people have raised for this view. The one I just mentioned actually is called the interface problem. So how do you get these two kinds of representations to interface in the right way? And the second problem, which I've worked on with my colleague Sebo Youthall, who, I don't know where he's at now, he used to be at Radboud, is what I call the operationalization and localization problem. So since I've written about these, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on them. I'll kind of talk about them in reverse order. The operationalization and localization problem is as follows. So let's say you believe in this view where you've got different kinds of representations standing in a particular kind of causal and semantic relationship to each other. The question is where in the head these kinds of causal relationships occur. And if you look at the relevant neuroscience, you can find a ton of decision variables that people have tried to represent. So you can think about this as ways of operationalizing or potentially operationalizing these attitudes. The problem is that there is no unique location for any of these attitudes or any of these kind of more abstract states that you could kind of try to tie to an attitude or a goal representation. So generally, if you look at these different kinds of variables, you get very wide distribution of cortical and subcortical areas. Importantly, you also get interspersal of representation of these variables, for instance, physiologically, with perceptual and motor variables. So initiating stimuli, chosen response, value of response. So I can happily talk more about this, but you don't find any clear junctures in the head, at least neuroscientifically speaking, where these two kinds of systems interact. And then the interface problem is basically what I just said. So how do you take this abstract, lexically structured representation, how do you start with that and end up with a detailed, structured representation of, for instance, this particular grasp in this particular direction towards this particular size and orientation of ice cream cone. On the causal theory as people interpret it, you start out with the abstract state, end up at the detailed motor state, and the question is how the process in between works. So there are a couple of solutions people have proposed to the interface problem. I don't think either of them work, as I've written elsewhere. So Butterfield and Senegalia say that an intention contains a demonstrative element, so kind of do this, where what this is a sensory motor representation. Mylopoulos and Pashuri suggest that there's kind of a series of more or less abstract representations as you go along this pathway. But I actually don't think either of these work, and the reason is really because if you think about the kind of thing that the motor system has to do, what it has to do is select a particular target out of all the targets that are compatible with ice cream, and it has to select a particular grasp type, aperture, and force out of all the sensory motor structures that are compatible with grasping, and there's just kind of no guidance in this representation for how to go about doing that. Because as I said, precisely what characterizes this kind of representation is that it's neutral with regards to any of these structures. So I don't think that either of these proposals will work. I've got a whole paper about this, so I can say more about that if you like. So I think that there are these problems. So again, we've got an implementation neutral or an implementation specific way of talking about folk psychological attitudes. I think the implementation specific way that people have discussed is problematic for these two reasons, the operationalization and localization problem and the interface problem. So I'm interested in just what an alternative is. What's an alternative form of how we make decisions and execute actions? And that is the broadly empirical perspective that I'm going to talk about in the next section of the talk. Okay. So I call this a variety of an embodiment account. All I mean by this is, as I say here, the constitutive involvement of sensory motor representation in quote unquote cognitive function. So there's a variety of things you might mean by embodiment. This is what I mean by it. So I'm not an anti-representationalist. I'm not an activist of like a pure stripe. I think this is what I originally meant by embodiment when I first started talking about it a bunch of years ago. So all of this means is that when we make these divisions between more cognitive or propositional representations and sensory motor representations, there's a constitutive involvement of the sensory motor representations in something like a decision-making process. So you notice that's not the case on the causal theory as I described it earlier. So on that theory, the decision happens in the practical reasoning system, which operates on propositional representations. And all that the motor system does is sort of carry out the content of the decision that's already made. The view the view I propose is that sensory motor representations are constitutively involved in the decision-making process. The process itself operates on those kinds of representations. So there's kind of three components to my view. I should also kind of apologize. This is a very big picture talk, so there's a lot going on here. I wanted to kind of give everyone the broad picture of what I'm thinking about, and then I can happily talk about more details of anything in the Q&A. So I'm just going to go through these three aspects of the view that I prefer of decision making, and then we can talk about it. So basically, the view that I have is not that decision operates in an abstract practical reasoning system. I think that decision operates in the sensory motor system according to a process of competition. So I'm drawing on a wide range of psychological and neural models here, which I will now proceed to explain. Okay, so the first part of this is a view based on psychology from the last 20 years and an explanatory framework that Bernard Hommel calls event files. What event files primarily are is just bidirectional associations between motor actions and their perceptual outcomes. So as Hommel often points out, this is a reprise of Williams' ideomotor theory of action, where the expectation of a particular kind of outcome is what triggers the action, which is this kind of like perception or imagery of the goal is what triggers the action. So here's how you investigate this experimentally. What you do is you have subjects perform an action, say a button press, and then that's just arbitrarily combined with some outcome. So say a light flashing. Then what you do is you switch the order. Then you use the former outcome as the trigger for the required action. And then you compare the compatible association with some other trigger for the action. And it turns out that actions are very much facilitated if they are triggered with an expected outcome. So you can kind of reverse this element of causation here, where you say, okay, well, we assume that there's this bidirectional association between an action and its expected outcome. If that's the case, then we should be able to use the outcome to cue the action, and that's exactly what you find. As I said, there are just dozens and dozens of papers on this paradigm, and what they show, and I want to cite that Hommel, again, Bernard Hommel is one of the leading figures in this work. He explicitly ties these event files, which again are associations between an action and its expected outcome, to decision making and planning. So this is how we represent a future goal and tie that goal to a current action. And what Hommel and others have shown is that event files are incredibly rich. So you can get them to include just task-irrelevant information if that happens to show up as an outcome of an action. You can get them to outstrip task instructions. You can get them to include categorical stimuli. So if you perform an action and see a cathedral, then your action can be cued by a perception of a picture of a cathedral. They can be cued by affect, so positive and negative affect as an outcome of your action, and they can range across space and time. So if you perform the action and then the outcome shows up a little bit down the road, you can still get this kind of effect. So it turns out that you can think about this associative structure for even relatively rich action representations, and that's going to be important for what I suggest later on. Okay, so here's what an event file is. It's a bidirectional associationship between a perceptual action, between a motor action and its perceptual outcome. But that's not right enough to run the picture that I want, because it turns out that what goals we have, what outcomes we expect, are keyed to what objects are in our environment. So I draw in a loose way on this old idea of affordances here. So this is the idea that which motor actions are available to you are based on the objects in your environment. So it's well established in the embodied cognition literature that perceiving certain types of objects cues the actions that are associated with them. So perceiving graspable objects cues grasping movements and so forth. The famous action compatibility effect with towards and away sentences and moving a drawer in and out. So the idea here is that you've got a set of affordances and a set of actions associated with them, which could lead to potential outcomes. And the perspective that people like Paul Zizek have argued for is that you can think of our deliberation as a kind of operation amongst potential affordances. So if you're thirsty, then the grasping affordance of the jar is more salient to you than the grasping affordance of the whatever those are, tater tots or whatever, because the action outcome associated with this is more salient to you given your needs. So we actually end up with a picture like this, where we've got object perception, associated motor affordances, and associated perceptual outcomes. And you can think of an action as kind of, an action representation as kind of being constituted of these. So when I perceive my coffee cup, which is right here, I am afforded an action grasp, which will lead to the outcome of taking a sip of coffee. The idea that's distinctive to the perspective I'm working on is that you can get these kinds of action representations within perceptual motor systems. So I think I'm going to skip that for now. How are we doing on time? Okay, not too bad. Well, actually, okay, so I'll go through this. So it turns out that you can actually use this to shape human decision making. So in this paradigm, they take advantage of what's called an object-specific satiety effect. So basically, if you eat a bunch of cashews, you will be less inclined to eat cashews, even though you may still eat something else like candy. But what they do is they pair an object with a perceptual cue, just an arbitrary perceptual cue. And then they have to satiety on that object. But then what they show is that just showing you the perceptual cue actually serves as a cue for picking that item. So even if you're satiated on cashews, if you get the perceptual cue that's associated with cashews, you will be more likely to choose cashews than you will some other object, even though you were previously satiated on it. So they quite explicitly tie these kinds of cues to consumer behavior, for instance, fast food logos and choosing to eat foods when you're otherwise satiated. So there's a bunch of interesting research on this. Okay, so the first part is these event files. The second part is a process of thresholded competition. And the way to think about this is what we call a decision, the behavioral option that we settle on, is actually the output of a process of competition between parallel represented options that are represented in parallel. So the very broadest way you can think about this is as a metaphor of a race. So you've got kind of behavioral options that are racing each other, and whoever crosses a finish line first wins. The finish line in this case is what is called a decision threshold. And basically, the idea here is you've got these event files represented in parallel in a given situation, and they are competing with each other for motivational salience. So they're competing with each other for which one is going to drive your which one is going to drive your behavior in this certain context. So if you're looking for this kind of process, and I'll say a little more about the models in a minute, if you're looking at this kind of process, you need to show a couple things. One, you need to show that behavioral options are represented in parallel. And two, you need to show the effect of thresholds and manipulating thresholds. So it turns out that action options are in fact represented in parallel in the motor system. So this is physiological research in monkeys by Paul Chizek and others. And basically what you do is you train monkeys to perform particular motor tasks to particular cues. And then you show them the cue, but they don't know which one is they have to act upon yet. And then you measure neural responses in the premotor cortex. And what they actually show is that when you show these perceptual options, when you show these possible action targets, the motor system starts responding in action-specific ways. So prior to a subsequent cue which tells them which action to perform, just perceiving the targets of the actions causes representation of the actions in the motor cortex, and these representations are actually modulated by the reward of the two associated objects. So this proves that just given perceptual cues, action outcomes are represented in your motor system in a way that's modulated by how valuable those outcomes are to you. So I think this is direct physiological evidence of this kind of decision process going on in the motor system. And indeed, that is how the researchers interpret it. You can also do all kinds of things that vary thresholds. So this is Chizek and colleagues again, and what they do is they vary the rate of trials in a task. So this is a monkey just having to guess which side more, so you have these items in this circle, they're moving to either side, the monkey has to guess which side is going to end up with more. But it turns out by varying the rate of the trials, you can change how the monkey guesses. So basically, if you make the trials speed up, that means the monkey gets more cracks at it and has more chances at rewards. So the monkey will actually lower, it will make decisions quicker and lower its decision threshold to take advantage of the greater availability of trials. And you can just quantify this effect in their decision patterns. You can also see direct physiological corollaries of the planning process in action in monkeys. So this is one of my favorite physiological studies in the prefrontal cortex. Basically what they do is they train monkeys to navigate through a maze in several steps. So the monkey's trained on the maze, but they don't know where they'll have to go in a particular trial. So then they start out in the middle and they're shown that they'll have to navigate to some particular target in the maze. What you can actually find in the prefrontal cortex is predictive activity of the sequence of movements that the monkey is going to make through the maze. So these are sequential movements organized in time and space, and you can actually find selective activity in the prefrontal cortex that's predictive of those sequential moves. So you've got a series of selective neurons predicting those moves in advance, and then those same neurons are actually active as the monkey goes through the maze at each particular point. So I think that this is a physiological corollary of this process of planning an action in a kind of event file space. If you look at neural models of decision making, a very common kind of model is where you've got competitive interactions between different populations representing stimulus response associations. So that's all this is here, is you've got a couple of different stimulus response associations. You're getting input from the environment and they're kind of competing with each other for which stimulus is going to drive the behavior. You can get much more complicated network models of this as well. Okay, so the basic idea here is we've got these perceptual motor event files and there's a competition running between them to generate your action. The question is, so I showed you this physiological evidence. The question is this at play in human decision making? And it turns out that in the kind of cognitive neuroscience of decision making, these kinds of race to threshold models are virtually ubiquitous in descriptions of actual human decisions. So here's an example. in this study, basically subjects had to look at a series of presented options. So I guess you can't see it very well. These would be like Doritos versus some other kind of snack food. And they'd have to look at them and select an option, and then they'd get to eat an example of that, whatever that object was that they selected. But what they did is they tracked subjects' eye movements as they are processing these cues. And what they had done is, prior to this study, they had gotten a kind of ranking from subjects about what objects were their favorites. And then they basically used that ranking to just bias an attention model, which in turn drives the subject's fixations. So basically, what goes on in this kind of paradigm is subjects don't immediately go to the object that they eventually pick. They continually debate back and forth between attending to each of these objects in turn. And what this shows is the time course of a decision. And what you see here is that you've got varying fixations across the decision process, and then the one that wins gets more fixations right towards the end. So what they suggest is that this is a competition process which is biased by your subjective liking of the object. So it's not like you just go right to the object that you like more. Basically, your subjective preferences just bias your attention towards the object, and then eventually the object that passes the decision threshold and wins the competition is the one that you select. So you can just measure in sort of pretty fine-grained physiological detail these processes playing out. The kind of cutting edge of these models I'm working on is right now is when using them to account for things like preference reversal. So there's attempts to take these kinds of decision to bound models and explain the whole range of preference reversal effects with them. So that's what I'm kind of reading about right now. You can also do a fair number of things with commitment and changes of mind. So if anyone has ever read Michael Bratman, he thinks the notion of intention comes along with an idea of commitment. And it turns out that if once you've crossed a decision threshold, you actually become less sensitive to new information. So there's a kind of variety of this notion of commitment here. And it turns out that in the motor decision area, you can actually get multiple stages. So people have modeled changes of mind with new information being presented with these diffusion to bound models. People have tried to use these to explain the pattern of activity across subjects in limit studies. So in a limit type study, it's, you say make this movement, but do it whenever you want. It turns out that across subjects, there's a distribution of onset times for the action, and you can model that distribution in terms of random fluctuations in one of these decision systems across the threshold. So that's really fascinating work. So the idea here is you've basically got, let me check the time. So the idea here is you've basically got this continually running competition process. So you're representing your environment and possible action outcomes, and you're representing possible options in parallel, and a competition is running in your decision system to see which behavioral option is going to drive your action. So actually, I'm gonna come back to that. So I just want to talk about some examples where I think that this shows up. And I think you can actually, what's kind of fun about this for me is I think you can just find phenomenological corollaries of these processes. So let's say you're standing in line at the cafe and you really just can't decide between tea or coffee, and you're going back and forth. But then you notice that the line behind you is lengthening and maybe people are grumbling. So you just kind of select whichever option is currently on your mind. In the kind of systems I'm looking at, this would be modeled as the lengthening of the line lowering the decision threshold, right? So there's an urgency signal that demands a current action, makes you go one way or another in the course of this decision. Here's another scenario. Assume you're leaving your office and you are deciding what to get for lunch. Maybe you've got only a certain amount of time. You could turn left or you could turn right. And if you turn left, there's pizza, and if you turn right, there's salad. So you stand there kind of hesitating, and then you remember that on the way to this place, there's a lot of construction work. So this pathway is going to be difficult for you. That kind of thing can downgrade this kind of option for behavioral salience and drive you towards selecting the pizza. You notice in these descriptions, I'm not actually adverting to reasons or attitudes. I'm talking about these decision processes as representations of behavioral options that are undergoing a kind of competition. So one thing you might say is, well, Dan, that's fine, but it's very obvious to me that when I'm thinking about actions, I'm reciting options to myself lexically, I'm reminding myself of what I want to do, I'm employing propositional resources as I think about my actions. And I think that's fine, because I think that propositional lexical representations do play a role in this system, but it's different than the traditional causal theory proposes. So it's not like you make the decision in this propositional format and then you perform the action on the basis of that. Rather, lexical representations play a kind of biasing role in the competition process. And this biasing role basically operates through attention. So here's two pictures you might show someone. So if you're looking at this set of pictures on the left and someone says the word snake, it's unsurprising that people immediately look at the snake, right? What's a little more surprising is if you're looking at this set of pictures and people, and you hear the word snake, you automatically cue towards this electrical coil. So it seems like there's a kind of associative relationship here, but it's not a semantic relationship, right? So there's not a semantic relationship between snake and cables. What there is a kind of low-level biasing relationship towards perceptual features that might be associated with snakes. You can get this from motor representations as well. So if you say the word typewriter in this kind of context, people will saccade back and forth between a typewriter and a piano. The idea here being that the motor actions involved with typewriters and pianos are similar, so you get an overlap in people's representations of those actions. So rather than sing out with a propositional intention and that determining your behavior, the idea here is that we use lexical representations as a kind of biasing device. So here's my example for this. I actually think that intentions kind of work like a grocery list works. So propositional intentions kind of work in the following way. You're walking down the aisle in the grocery store, and there's just this incredible amount of actions you might pursue, right, to objects with varying degrees of reward. So you're walking down, and there's the Doritos over here, and there's the beer up here, and that all looks pretty good. But when you consult your list, what you're doing is biasing yourself to attend to certain kinds of objects, which will then take on behavioral salience. So when you are going down the aisle, you're using your grocery list or your mental rehearsal of, I need to get peanuts, I need to get vegetables, as a kind of cueing system for your decision system, which focuses you on particular kind of objects rather than others. And I think we can look at this, we can see this in just how kind of like often ineffective grocery lists are. So you often get what you want, but you often also, at least I also often get beer and ice cream. Because when I'm passing those items, even though they're not on my list, they just take on a kind of behavioral salience for me because of the high reward that I associate with those items. Okay, so I think for time, I'm going to go through, I'm going to mostly skip this part, we can come back to it. Basically, what I think of as agency in this kind of framework is temporally extended control over action outcomes. So think about the situation where you're trying to get the salad, but then you remember that there's a barrier between you and the salad, some construction or something like that. Basically, you would have to exert more control to pay attention to the salad outcome, right? So in order to actually pursue the salad outcome, you have to nest several options together. That involves additional cost, whereas the pizza is ready to hand and very rewarding anyway, right? So the idea here is that what agency is temporal extension in action outcomes. So basically, your ability to be moved by a less salient immediate, a more distant reward rather than an immediately more salient reward. So I know that the outcomes of my working out are good, but when I go to get on the elliptical, I never want to do it, right? So I have to use my envisioning of the good outcome, namely my being in better shape, to overcome my initial reticence to get on the elliptical. So I just want to end by talking about all the ways that I'm planning on extending this. So there's a number of things you need in order to scale these up. I apologize for going in reverse order. So in order to scale up this kind of view, you need a very rich view of perception, where perception and action can be represented in your perceptual system. Fortunately, there's a ton of work in philosophy of perception that suggests that perception is rich in all these kinds of ways. You also need a variety of mental time travel. So you need to be able to picture yourself eating the salad at some point in the future. That has to be an action outcome that's possibly salient to you. You also need to be able to use imagery to envision a course of action. So this is where I think what I'm thinking about interacts with some of what Benza is working on imagery and decision making. So I need to be able to envision that if I go in this route, there will be construction, and that will be a barrier to my action. And then really importantly, I think we need to have perceptions of social context. So in my tea versus coffee example, you are perceiving a kind of social stimulus, which is the grumbliness of the people behind you. And what that causes is a lowering of your decision threshold, which causes you to just go for whatever option you're currently considering. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop there. I just want to argue that, being ambiguous about the explanatory role of the attitudes, I think, just doesn't tell apart between these very different kinds of choice architectures that we might be talking about, the very different kinds of cognitive architectures that are at play in decision-making or might be involved in decision-making. So in the paper that I mentioned, I kind of argue for this conclusion and say, like, there's no right way to construe the attitudes, but we need to understand how they fit into an empirical architecture. And then the bigger project is to just kind of make a philosophy of action out of this. So to think about the phenomenology of action, to think about the way that social influences affect our decisions and behaviors, to think about the way that, to think about the reasons why marketing is so effective, to think about disorders of agency such as addiction and obsessive compulsive disorder. And I think that the kind of picture I'm working on, appropriately fleshed out, has a lot of phenomenological traction, at least for much more phenomenological traction than the kind of Williams picture where I just sit and add up all my internal reasons and then act. I think it's got a huge amount of explanatory resources for explaining things like decision under pressure, decision in inattentive action, and decision in social contexts. And I think that it makes the best sense of what we can best learn about cognitive architecture from psychology and neuroscience. So as you can probably tell, I just pitched you a book project in 50 minutes, which is why that was so quick. I apologize for that, but I'm really excited about this idea and just wanted to kind of get it out to you since I'm at the beginning of this book project and just kind of see what you all thought about it. So thanks so much for sitting through that very fast talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have or give more detail on literally any part of this. So thanks.